A congregant forwarded me an Instagram post from someone named Shoshana a few days ago. The post read, "How politics will affect your shul this week." Is your rabbi conservative, by which she means small c conservative? You get a Trump is somehow Pinchas drasha. Is your rabbi liberal? You get a Kamala Joe Yeshua Moshe drasha. Is your rabbi a woman? Slochad's daughters drasha, no matter what. It really has been quite a week, quite a few weeks. Trump's attempted assassination, J.D. Vance, Biden bowing out, Kamala's rise, Democratic veepstakes, Bibi's speech, his meeting the next day with Biden and Harris, pro-Israel, anti-Bibi protesters in Washington, peaceful anti-Israel protests, vicious anti-Israel pro-Hamas demonstrations, the specter of Munich 1972, questions about Jewish safety in Paris, Ambassador Martin Indych's death. Some of these developments and data points I find intriguing, even energizing. Other things I find sad, downright terrifying. Mostly I'm just kind of exhausted. So at the risk of disappointing Shoshana on Insta, I think I'm not going to choose options A, B, or C, nor D through F. Today, I want to talk about zealotry, specifically religious zealotry. And I want to be clear from the outset that I'm not talking about a particular brand of zealotry. I know for many of you, when you hear those words, your mind immediately jumps to a person, a group of people. But today, my goal isn't to point out a specific manifestation of this impulse in the US, in Israel, in politics, this Bible group, that yeshiva, that madrasa. I'm more interested in looking closely at the character for whom this week's parsha is named, Pinchas, son of Eleazar, grandson of Aaron the high priest. The action unfolded actually last week at the end of Parashat Balak, while Israel was at Shittim Ha'am Liznot El Benot Moav. The people whored themselves with the daughters of Moav, who invited them to offer sacrifices to Baal Peor, their deity. The Israelites do worship this foreign god. Idolatry is a really big no-no in Torah, and there is a steep price to pay. Pinchas then slays in pretty brutal fashion two individuals, an Israelite and a Midianite, who were engaged in cult sexuality within the kubah, or chamber. Ibn Ezra explains that this is a euphemism for the Ohel Moed, for the tent of meeting. So just kind of imagine for a moment, right, what's happening and also where it's happening. It might be like if, I don't know, Rav Tyler caught two people worshiping Aphrodite through some sort of sex act on the bima upstairs. You weren't away for that long, it's not. Every time I leave town, something happens. Anyway, I can't imagine Rav Tyler would impale people to the belly. We're a pretty progressive shul. But we might have to look at your membership status. I'm thinking at least probation would be in order. So in our parsha, 24,000 people die of a plague, but Pinchas manages to forestall a greater catastrophe. At the beginning of Parashat Pinchas, it seems pretty clear that the pshat, the plain meaning of the text, justifies Pinchas's violent intervention. What happens? God says to Moshe, Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion for me, so that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion. Lachen amor hineni noten lo et briti shalom. Say, therefore, I grant him my covenant of peace. And Pinchas's descendants are rewarded with Brit Kehunat Olam, the eternal priesthood. And you might be asking yourself, what does it mean to serve God? Is this the last word on Pinchas, on vigilante justice, on religious leadership? Is zealotry of this type a virtue? 3 different haftarot from this time of year in the Torah cycle may shed some light for us. The prophet Jeremiah poses a question to us in today's haftarah. What does it mean to have a divine calling? Before I created you in the womb, I selected you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. How are we to serve? How are we meant to bring God into the world? These are the questions I want to focus on today. Now, the rabbis are more ambivalent about Pinchas and his model of religiosity than the Torah narrative seems to be. Midrash Tanchuma suggests that we really get to know what Pinchas was about after the community enters the land. So you may recall that 2 weeks ago, during Shabbat Chukat, we read a haftorah from the book of Judges. It's the tale of Yiftach the Gileadite, a warrior, Ben Zonah, not the modern Hebrew insult, but an actual son of a prostitute, someone from humble beginnings who rises to the upper echelon of military leadership. Yiftach is facing a daunting battle against Bnei Ammon. So he makes a vow to Hashem: if you deliver the Ammonites into my hands, hayotze asher yetze midlatei vati likrati, whatever comes out of my door of my house to meet me upon my safe return, and then the text continues, shall be the Lord's and shall be offered by me as a burnt offering. But alas, Yiftach Hagiladi is tragically imprecise with his vow. God does deliver Bnei Ammon into the hands of the Israelites, and when Yiftach returns home to Mitzpah, his only child, his daughter, comes out to greet him dancing with a timbrel. Now, one would think that would be the end of the story. But Sefer Shoftim, the book of Judges, is frequently interested in cautionary tales, and this, I have to say, is among the worst. On seeing her, the text tells us, he rent his clothes and said, "Alas, daughter, you have brought me low, you have become my troubler, for I have uttered a vow to the Lord, and I cannot retract it. Father," she said, "do to me as you have vowed, seeing that the Lord has vindicated you against your enemies, the Ammonites." The daughter then takes 2 months to go lament her maidenhood in the hills, after which time she returns, and as the book says, he did to her as he had vowed. Now the story ends by telling us that every year the maidens of Israel go and chant dirges for the daughter of Yiftach HaGiladi. Some commentators, being appropriately horrified by this tale and what it might say about God and those who serve him, believe that Yiftach's daughter spent the rest of her life in exile. But this is a stretch and hardly apparent in the text. What's more interesting, I think, is that the Midrash castigates Yiftach for this halachic and, yes, moral blunder. And more than that, it blames not just Yiftach, but also the priest of his time for this tragic turn of events. And who do you think that was? So Midrash Tanchuma assumes that it is now Pinchas, our Pinchas, who's assumed this role of Kohen Gadol in the time of Yiftach. It reads, in the case of Yiftach the Gileadite, because he was not a Torah scholar, he lost his daughter. You see, God was mad at Yiftach, or mad that Yiftach said whatever comes out of the house. What if, I don't know, a non-kosher animal walks out of the house? Presumably he had animals living with him in his complex, and that's what he was intending. Would you sacrifice that animal to me if it wasn't a kosher animal? So what does God do? God sends Yiftach's daughter to the door to teach him a lesson about being more precise in his vows. But the lesson God wanted Yiftach to learn is clearly not the one that he does learn. Such is the way of the zealot, who is also an ignoramus. God assumes that he will notice the lack of specificity in his vow and question his words. After all, when other characters, like Hannah, for example, offer their children to God, they enter a life of service, not human sacrifice. That's never the point for us. Furthermore, doesn't pledging to sacrifice an invalid animal invalidate the vow? if a pig were to walk out of the door, you wouldn't offer up a pig as a sacred olah. All the more so, a human being is never valid as an offering. But instead, Yiftach deifies the vow, right? Worshipping his words, falsely assuming our God would demand the fulfillment of such a morally perilous pledge. But the Midrash goes even further, laying out one zealot and adding it to the other. Why didn't Pinchas intervene? After all, the rabbis understand him to be a Torah scholar, unlike Yiftach. But even if someone argues that a vow is a vow, everyone knows that the high priest of the day can annul vows. That's one of the roles of the high priest. Apparently, both Pinchas and Yiftach were too pompous to change course. Pinchas said to himself, I am a high priest and son of a high priest. Shall I humble myself to go to an Am Haaretz, to an ignoramus? Yiftach said to himself, I am head of the tribes of Israel and head of the magistrates. So I humble myself to go to a commoner? Between the two of them, warns the Midrash, that poor woman perished from the world. In fact, as I learned from Rabbi Shai Held, who was a scholar in residence here back in 2019, a later Midrash, Tana Debe Eliyahu, reminds us that immediately following the sacrifice of his daughter, Yiftach is confronted by men from the tribe of Ephraim who are angry at having been excluded from the battle with the Ammonites and threaten to burn Yiftach's house down over him. A battle then ensues, and Yiftach kills 42,000 people. Right? That's in chapter 12 of Judges. Tana Debe Eliyahu imagines that Pinchas, the high priest, should have intervened on Yiftach's behalf here, saying to the Ephraimites, to annul his vow you did not come, but to fight with him you've come? But Pinchas again says nothing. The Midrash's words are scathing, writes Held. Who really killed all those people? Say that Pinchas did it. He could have interpreted on Yiftach's behalf and did not do so. He could have annulled Yiftach's vow and did not do so. Which brings me to the second Haftorah portion, the one that we might have read today, but for this being the Shabbat of admonition. Because the Haftorah assigned to Parashat Pinchas is the story of another zealot, another biblical character whose fervor for divine service leads to confrontation, even violence. In other years, we read from Malachim Aleph, from 1 Kings, the story of Elijah. But we don't read the story of his confronting and defeating the priests of Baal. Pinchas is paired with the aftermath of that story, in which Eliyahu is fleeing from Ahab and Jezebel. Then the word of the Lord came to him. He said to him, Why are you here, Elijah? He replied, I am moved by zeal for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to the sword. I alone am left, and they are out to take my life. Come out, he called, and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And lo, the Lord passed by. There was a great and mighty wind, splitting mountains and shattering rocks by the power of the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, but Hashem was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a kol dmama daka, a still small voice. Now, to be sure, this is hardly the end of violence or divine retribution in Tanakh. But this part of Elijah's story, I believe, opens him up to a different sort of rabbinic interpretation. Pinchas, for his part, becomes a midrashic villain, steeped in pomposity and moral superiority. Elijah becomes a midrashic hero, humble and kind, showing up on countless occasions in generational folktales to help people discover their better religious selves. What does it mean to serve God, I ask? What does it mean to have a religious calling? Rabbi Harold Shulweiss, Zichrono Livracha, a longtime rabbi of Valley Beth Shalom in Encino, California, pioneer within the Chabura movement and creator of the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous, coined the post-Holocaust term predicate theology. Predicate theology, as in the predicate of a sentence, suggests that human action brings God into the world as a force for good. Morality needs evidence, hard data, Schulweis writes. Facts in our time and in our place to nourish our faith in man's capacity for decency. Wisdom calls for a moral autology, how to make one hear the unpleasant truth without destroying his sensitivity to the still, small voice of conscience and hope. The still, small voice from Elijah's time whispers, it seems, for us too. So I'll conclude with a final bit of wisdom from a third Haftorah, from last week's Parsha Balak, chanted just after the Torah details Pinchas' act of zealotry. What is the lesson the prophet Micha wants us to learn? Which by extension means, what is the lesson the rabbis who selected this Haftorah want us to learn in that moment? The Haftorah concludes with the following famous instruction. Higid lecha adam ma tov u'ma Adonai doresh mimcha. He has told you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice, to love goodness, and to walk humbly with your God. Micha isn't concerned with what scholars call legal positivism, this notion that law is divorced from ethics, that a vow is a vow is a vow. Micha doesn't believe that the good life, the life expected of the religious, is to exact violence in God's name and then retroactively justify that violence as a necessary extension of one's faith. Justice may sometimes require military action. Tanakh and Chazal do not doubt that, but doing justice cannot be sequestered from loving goodness, from walking with humility and modesty. Micha is a bulwark against legal formalism and the weaponization of Torah against basic norms of decency. Elijah comes to recognize that humility, listening in the quiet places to the still small voice, begets conscience and hope. So he earns a place of honor in the Midrash. Pinchas, Yiftach, these zealots earn a place of infamy. The Cotzin Rabbi once poignantly remarked, God is where you let him in. What does it mean to have a divine calling? It is to be called and then humbly to listen. Shabbat Shalom.